Hey there.
How's it going?
All right, how about you?
Pretty good. Finals week and school coming to a close. My last week, so a little hectic, but not too bad.
Yeah, I've got a couple of classes coming up at finals, but nothing yet. Not for another couple of weeks.
Yeah, I feel that.
Well, anyway, so topic Electoral College should be replaced with a popular vote system. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and lay out my argumentation, which is basically going to cover first the original intent of the Electoral College, what it was actually designed to do, and
Okay.
then why I think we need to be going to a popular vote system. So, there are
Okay.
basically just 2 points there, and then you can respond to them in your turn.
Okay.
So my first point is about the original intent of the Electoral College. Now, just to be clear, the Electoral College, I think both of us obviously know what it is, but in case anybody watching doesn't, the Electoral College is basically the system we use to elect the president. Under the original framework of the Constitution, the Electoral College was a group of people chosen by the state legislature, which equaled the number of senators and representatives that each state had altogether. So, for example, in the original system, New Hampshire would have 3 representatives and Virginia 10, I believe. So it was basically just however many representatives they had plus 2, so those 2 senators. So this meant that each state would have something roughly proportional to its population plus 2. So then these people would get together and they'd all vote on who they thought was the best president. As time went on, what eventually happened was that states began to basically, if not actually legally bind the electors to the results of the popular vote for the president, they decided to at least informally, culturally bind them to do that. And that's what happens most of the time, though there are occasionally some faithless electors who, for example, in the last 2016 election, who do things like break ranks and instead of voting for Hillary Clinton, vote for Colin Powell or Ron Paul instead of Trump. So that's basically the way it works. Electors are formally free to do whatever they want, but most of the time they're supposed to do what their state actually voted for. So with that, let's go into the original reason that the Electoral College was established. And there are basically 2 reasons. The first is that of technological constraints, and this is a pretty big one. Now, the founders in 1780s were dealing with a government over a nation which was very large, like larger than almost any nation in Europe at the time. And so when you're talking about having an election for one man to lead this, you're looking at an enormous expanse. There just wasn't a way in the 1780s for one man to successfully campaign across the nation. And secondly, for one man to be able to be well known to all the people in the nation so that they could all go and vote on the same day and all that get together and have it out and make sure everything's correct. There just wasn't a way to make sure that everything was going to happen the way it should so that everybody can make an educated decision and that they can logistically work out the election of one guy across the entire nation. So these technological constraints meant that the founding fathers realized there needed to be some kind of intermediary so that it wasn't just a popular election that just wouldn't work technologically. But the second point, the second reason that they did it, comes down to the aristocratic compromise, basically, that was involved. Now, the founding fathers initially had 2 different competing ideas of what the Electoral College, how the president should be elected. The first was that he should be chosen directly by Congress, like have a congressional election for the president. The second was he should be voted in directly by the people. So what they decided to do was they decided to compromise on these points. One was to have basically one was favoring the aristocratic notion where you have, at the time, you had the property owners selecting the House of Representatives and the state legislatures selecting the Senate. So this was a more aristocratic group of people than you would otherwise, especially since they're people of power and trust. So they were saying basically that aristocrats should be able to choose who becomes the president. On the other hand, you had the common people who would be choosing it. Well, common as they were, being basically white property owners at the time in most states. But the aristocratic compromise basically was, they were like, we don't know for sure how exactly to elect the president. Let's go for a compromise here. Because then it enabled the people to be chosen by the state legislature and thus have a more of a connection to the people than Congress would be, since the Senate was chosen by the state legislature and was for that reason a step up from the state legislature. But basically what it meant was there's still this intermediary group, but is not nearly as aristocratic. There's more of a connection to the people than just having Congress involved. And this is what the entire Federalist 68 is about. Like if you look at Alexander Hamilton's Federal 68, which is the reason why the Electoral College and his defense of the Electoral College, it's not about the states having some kind of say in the presidency. It's about basically having this intermediary group between the people and the Congress to choose the president. So that's like the reason that we have the government, that we have the Electoral College at all. So the original intent of it is basically to make a technological thing that's going to work logistically and to compromise between having the common people and the higher ups choosing the president. Now, with our current system, that's not at all how it works, which is where we get into my second point, which is more about why we should change it. That it basically unprivileges some votes, or it privileges some votes more than others. And there are a couple of other points under this. The first is that when you have less population, that equals more power. And the reason for this is because of the structure of the Congress. You have a proportional representation in the representatives, the House of Representatives, and then 2 more for each state on top of that. That means that the least populous states, some state like Wyoming, for example, is going to have a lot more power than a state like California. In fact, Wyoming's voters is worth about 3.5 times as much as a Californian voter in the 2016 election under the Electoral College. So basically what this means is that states with less population get more political power per voter than others do. And that leads me to my second point, which is that some states are better than others. Basically, when you have this situation, you have states and their citizens thereof, which become less powerful than other states, which means we're getting away from the one man, one vote into some people, on virtue of them living in a less populated state, having more political power than others do. And yes, I'm assuming that you're going to bring up some more of the arguments on like the power of the states and all that. And I just wanted to say right now, I used to be someone who really did believe in the Electoral College, and I believed it was something that needed to be kept around. But given, like, as I've studied it more and like studied the actual intent behind the Electoral College and thought about this whole idea of some votes being more valuable than others, I've come to the opposite conclusion. And that's why I'm defending this resolution today.
Yeah, so I agree with your like historical context in the background. My main point to your argument would come at how the purpose of the Electoral College today. So the main purpose that it serves today is stopping a tyrannical majority, right? In America, I think that's a very important ideal, is how we are, a creation of a bunch of minority groups, and we're kind of the melting pot, as like people like to say about our culture. And so with pure democracy, the analogy they normally use is 2 wolves and a chicken deciding what to have for dinner, right? The Electoral College defends some of those minority groups, and I think that's probably its greatest purpose, is how it prevents a tyrannical majority from being able to just dominate, the electoral system. Now, I do agree that there's probably some room for change. Like, I believe the specific number, I've looked at the study between Wyoming and California too, is 55,000 voters. That's something like 200-something thousand in California. But I think that's more due to like a specific rule of the Electoral College rather than just, like the whole system being invalid together. So it's 3 electoral votes is the minimum you can have, right? So I think maybe some sort of like weight can be added to certain states to try and amend it, make it more of a balanced system altogether. But I think the idea and like what it represents entirely, because right now we have the country's 77% Caucasian. I don't think it'd be fair if the Caucasian people always elected a Caucasian president just because, they're 77% of the population. And so I think it's pretty important. I also think the system is kind of, it's matched with the popular vote on almost every occasion. There's only been 5 presidents in U.S. history to win the Electoral College vote and not have the popular vote out of the 45 that we have. I think it's a really big issue now just because it most recently happened in 2016. But since that, it hadn't happened since 1888. And so I think that the system, while it is like slightly flawed, I think it's still a vastly better system than the popular vote just because it protects those minority groups that have different interests than the people that live in highly popular areas.
Okay, I have a couple of questions then.
Okay.
So you say it's not like the best system. So what exactly do you see as the best system for electing a president?
That's pretty hard to say. I think the Electoral College system is good in its idea. I do think maybe some sort of like I know I dislike the idea of the delegates that are by the party put and that they can be a rogue delegate. I don't like that system at all, and especially since some states allow that and other states, fine you for doing such a thing. I think that needs to be a federally mandated thing. On top of that, but I do just think that perhaps weighing some of these larger states bigger, I do think that it's rather unfair that a state like Wyoming gets one vote for 55,000 people. But I do think it's important that it exists in that way somewhat, because it's not fair also if all the people in California can vote for whatever is best in their interest and the people in Wyoming don't get a voice because they don't have the population to do so, especially with California, being a much different culture than maybe a state like Montana, where I lived for a while, that has, a very rural culture, for example. So I can't tell you the exact perfect solution. I think that takes someone with a lot more research and studying than I've done on this topic, and hopefully somebody comes along some way and does it. But it's definitely, I think the Electoral College system is in the right direction more than a strictly popular vote system.
Yeah, and I definitely understand where you're coming from with it. Like, as I said before, I've been in exactly your position. Like, I once wrote a speech and gave it about why we need to keep the Electoral College. So it's just been pretty recently I've come to the opposite conclusion. And it was as I was studying the founders and getting more into political philosophy.
Yeah.
So basically my argument in response to what you have to say about the whole idea of running a tyrannical majority. Now, I definitely agree with this, and I see where you're coming from with it. But I think that the Electoral College isn't the way we should be trying to prevent a tyrannical majority. Now, the first reason I think that's true is because there are other ways of doing so. For example, look at the Bill of Rights, which is a much more effective way to limit what the majority democratically can do. Because it just basically says, here's what you can do and what you can't do. That's how that works. It says, you can't take our religious freedom away. You can't take our freedom of speech away, regardless of whether you have the presidency and the entirety of Congress. So I see that as perhaps the most effective way of limiting what a tyrannical majority can do, actually impacting it to the rights of the people. So if you're talking about rights, I don't think that any kind of president being elected or even the entirety of Congress can successfully, in many cases, take our rights away.
Well, I'm not talking specifically. I'm just going to respond to that real quick. I'm not talking specifically about rights in general, but let's say, they for example, I live in Atlanta currently, and your car has to pass an admissions test, right, to be able to get a license plate and drive in the city of Atlanta. If I'm a rural farmer in Texas, and all the people in Atlanta that has, Georgia has a population of several million compared to maybe, like I said earlier, state of Montana has a population of 1 million. It just gives the Montana voters kind of a level ground to be able to vote in their interest and not be trounced by some not necessarily always a tyrannical majority, but just people with other interests that happen to live in bigger states or more urban areas. It's not always about rights. It's just specific regulations that would kind of impact their lifestyle, not as much as taking away religious freedom or something like that.
Yeah, that's where I thought you were going with it, the idea of interest rather than rights, which is where my second couple of arguments come in.
Okay.
So my second argument in response to this whole idea of interest specifically is the idea that this is a pretty ineffective way of trying to decide whose interest should win out. Because when you look at it, the president, there's only one of him. And there's only going to ever be one president for 4 years unless something unfortunate happens, like he gets impeached or he dies and the vice president has to take over. But anyway, he's still going to be from the same party all in all likelihood, so that's kind of irrelevant. The problem I see here is that when you're talking about trying to represent the rights of the majority or the interests of the minority versus the interests of the majority, you've got to have some way of weighing them, and you've got to decide basically who's going to be more important when you're making one decision. So when you have a system like Congress, which takes the Senate and the House of Representatives together, it makes sure that because a state has a lot of population, that it can't just overrun the other states and with its interests. There's a check on that. But also the House of Representatives, which does represent people's population, does represent minority groups who live in a state like Montana as opposed to Atlanta, Georgia. There's that form of limitation on the government. When you just have the president himself, there's only one of him, and there only ever can be one winner of the presidential election. So I think it's a little bit of a mistake to say that the interests of the minority will be best characterized by this one decision of the president, or that the interest of the minority should trump the interest of the majority in these cases. Now, as you said earlier, that doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, it can be pretty bad. Like when you have the majority of people choosing one thing and the minority of people choosing the other thing, that means somebody's interests are going to get sacrificed. And at some point we have to say, if we're not involving rights here, and we already have systems of representation in place to protect those people, then why should we allow a minority to control and rule over the majority, thanks to a system like the Electoral College? And I'll let you respond to that. I have one more argument in response. If you want to,
yeah. So I agree. I don't think that the minority group should have their ways or their problems, outweigh that of the majority, because that's just lunacy. But I do think that it forces the presidents to care about the minority groups in America. For example, if you just needed the popular vote, you could be a president, and every day of the week you could just campaign in California, Texas, and New York, and then you'd have the popular vote. If you just campaign in the very large states. But with the Electoral College system, while the minority's voice doesn't outshine that of the majority, it still makes it important for them to go talk to the peach farmers in rural Georgia, or for them to go talk to the cattle ranchers in Montana. It doesn't make their voice any more important, or I don't even think it infringes on that of the majority, but it just makes them important in the whole grand scale of things.
Yeah, I get where that is, but I'll respond to that with my last argument, which I kind of is going to be about that. And one other note of clarification about it. So, I think that when you have a nationwide system, there are a lot of people who go neglected. Like Trump went like 47 visits to Florida last year in 2016. Like that's what he had to do in order to win the presidency. But when you have this system like the system where people do have to go to these other states where is a nationwide popular vote, nobody's going to win just by winning California and New York. You're going to have to go and talk to other people. And what it's going to mean is that you aren't just campaigning in Ohio and Florida. You have to campaign across the nation, because suddenly the farmers of upstate New York won't just be outweighed by Democrats in the city. So I think that you're going to care about other minorities if you have a popular vote, because they do come into play more than when one state's majority can overrule their minority interest. And then my second argument, my final argument in response to the whole idea of the tyrannical majority here, is it's about the role of the president, basically. Now, the president himself doesn't have that much of an important role in making law, or honestly that much in creating domestic politics. Like in his actual role, what the president does in regard to domestic politics is gives a State of the Union address, pardons prisoners. He can. The other thing is like vetoing bills and all that. Like if you actually look at the Constitution, he doesn't do that much in regard to domestic politics, nowhere near as much as Congress does. So if you want to stop the interests of the majority from trampling over the interests of the minority in a really issue where they are needing to be considered, then the president is not the one you're going to go to. Like the president's most important jobs are doing things like representing America overseas and commanding the army and the other forces of the United States. Like it's not like he has some enormous constitutional role in developing legislation and trying to care for the future of America by doing what's best for domestic interests. And if you'd like to say something about that, I'm going to actually pull up the Constitution and clarify exactly what I'm saying there.
I agree with you on that point about the president, where the president doesn't have this almighty power to just shift the entire country if they are a member of the tyrannical majority. But I do think indirectly they do hold a lot of power, and through the people that they appoint. So, for example, the president appoints every single person in the board of governors in the Federal Reserve, right? So when you have somebody like, let's say, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, because that's the most recent example, and they both talk about what they want to do to interest rates. Well, even though the president directly doesn't have the power to change interest rates, they appoint the people that do, as an example of that. So I do think that's somewhat important. And like I said earlier, I think that the electoral system does have its flaws. I don't think how the popular vote system is going to help in some of the aspects that it does. You talked about how it's going to force them to talk with the minorities more in the country. But when you have a state like California that's 12% of the population, right? It's not worth their time to go and spend that one day to campaign in Montana and get those 3 electoral votes when they can spend time in California. In a popular vote system, they're not going to go to Montana and worry about those 1 million votes when they can, go to a, rally in somewhere like LA and talk to several million people. It's just, I feel like it just skews the problem a little bit more and doesn't really solve it in that aspect as far as making them care about the minorities. Because it just outweighs, they're never going to go to any of the smaller states. And I think that's one of the things the Electoral College really shines at. But because those votes are so important and so deciding in the states like Wyoming, where it's only 55,000 people per vote, I think that makes it really important compared to some place like popular vote system where you have to go to California and just preach to all those people and hope that you can get at least half of the 12 million votes in that state.
Okay, so I think, and basically it's come down to, I think we have 2 major arguments on the table here in regard to the whole idea of an indirect, like in regard to the whole idea of protecting against the interests of a majority and protecting the interests of the minority. Mm-hmm. And so we talked about the president's power and what he actually has, and the whole idea of, is the president actually going to care about the minority votes? Because let's talk about those in turn. So to start out with, the whole idea that the president doesn't have that much power over domestic politics. Now, you are correct in that he does have a lot of power over the heads of the departments, specifically. Now, the president does make a lot of appointments, and his Article 2 power to do so is absolutely there. But if you look at the actual Constitution, it says that he has the power to appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper, and the president alone in the courts of the law or in the heads of the departments. Now, basically the way that works today is most everybody who matters has to be confirmed by Congress in order to get there. Like judges, heads of departments, all of them have to be confirmed by the Congress. So again, that goes back to the whole idea of what's actually limiting the power here. And I think the Congress, as I said earlier, is a much more effective limiter of the majority interest and the protector of the minority than the president is necessarily. So I think when you're looking at even that, pretty much the only significant domestic power that the president has is the ability to veto legislation, or independent of Congress. He can veto or sign legislation, and he has some indirect power in terms of influencing stuff. In terms of influencing things, I don't think that the president can't, if we can look at the example of Donald Trump, for example. Donald Trump is the president of the United States, of course, but he's encountered enormous amounts of opposition, even from his own party. And so I don't think the president inherently has that much power to influence and cause people to pass legislation. So that's where I see that whole issue of presidential power. And lastly, the point about what's the president actually going to care about minority people? Now, I think if you look at it from what's going on right now, what's going on during the election, you see that the president actually does care about minorities, and they're always going and visiting states. If presidents go and visit places like California, even though it's a lock who's going to win California. Clinton went and Trump went in, and they went and did rallies in California, even though they all knew Clinton was going to win California. That was not even a question. So they do go to visit states that they aren't going to win necessarily, or they are going to win. But what you have when you have the Electoral College is it's going to skew in favor of some minorities. As I said earlier, Florida got visited 47 times by Donald Trump. And so the minorities there got a lot of attention. But the minorities in New York's upstate, not so much. It's just basically another way of saying some people have more valuable voices than others. And that's basically my entire point. The original intent isn't really realized anymore. And when you look at it in terms of the actual principle behind it, we're overwhelming and undermining democracy by undergoing rid of this entire one vote, one man system. And that's basically, unfortunately, what the Electoral College does.
Yeah, and I can understand your criticism with it. Like, it's a very complex issue. So to start with your point about the presidential power, so the president does have power to reappoints and everything. He vetoes, but most things are done through Congress. That's true. But with the popular vote system, right? You have the House of Representatives, which is population based, which would probably normally going to do things in favor of the majority, right? You have the Senate, which is out just for every state. So let's say they go into the minority. Okay, if bill goes to the president, they're always going to go into the majority if it's a popular vote system most of the time, right? Unless it's something outrageous. But normally they're going to do whatever policy when they're campaigning. They're going to support a policy that's going to make the majority vote for them in the popular vote system, whatever policy it is. And then eventually, when they get elected, they're going to follow through those policies because they want to get reelected or continue their political careers or whatnot. And so I do think it causes a problem for minority groups to get their voices heard, because on the campaign trail, now if you want, let's say, I don't know, let's say African Americans, if you want the African American vote in some place like Georgia and you're Donald Trump and you come to a rally, you're going to suggest some sort of legislation or some action that you're going to push for, support, or take that is going to help the African American community. But if you go to Georgia in a popular vote system, you don't honestly have to worry about that, because you can just try and plead to the Caucasians and just push forward for some legislation that's going to support them, and then you're going to get their vote. And white people are a much bigger percentage of the American population. They're 77% of the America's population. So it basically all comes back to that tyrannical majority idea, where you can just appeal to the majority, and then the minority doesn't really have a voice in a lot of these states, even with the popular vote system. I'm not saying the Electoral College is perfect at it, because, like you said, Florida, minorities got much more attention than those in New York. But I don't think that the popular vote system fixes the problem. Now, to your point about how it's strayed so much far from the original intention, I agree, and I do think that that's kind of a problem. But a lot of things do kind of have to be changed over time. That doesn't apply for everything in the Constitution or everything done by the founding fathers, but America does change over time, and some things need to be corrected for the changing times, such as we didn't have an Air Force put into place, any legislation back then, things such as that. They have to just change over time based on the demographic of America, current technological advancements and whatnot. And I think that it's, the Electoral College is kind of like a beautiful accident in that way, as it wasn't intended for the purpose that it does now. But it does just such an excellent job. Most of the times that you have the popular vote, in the Electoral College system, they go hand in hand. It's only, like I said, it's limited 5 times in 45 presidents. But when you have something like just the popular vote system, some of these very niche cases where the Electoral College did prove through, it wasn't by much. It was still 48, 47. I think Trump was down to 45% of the popular vote, and that's some of the lowest it's ever been. So once again, it's not by much, and the deciding factor does come down to those small voices. But that's just such an extreme outlier example to replace the entire system that's done a fairly good job so far. I don't really see how the popular vote system would be such a giant change in the way of electing the president.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about basically the whole philosophy behind this, and we're going to talk about the philosophical foundations right now, because I think that's something that's been a little bit neglected throughout this debate. But Let's talk about the whole idea of the interest of the minority versus interest of the majority. Now, there's nothing inherently valuable about the interest of the minority, I don't believe. For example, if you look at one of the most infamous cases of the Senate versus the House of Representatives, one representing the majority versus one representing the minority, it was back in antebellum America. And the reason that was a big issue was because the slave states had to keep making sure that there were slave states that could put somebody in the Senate to maintain parity with their northern anti-slavery opponents, because the northern anti-slavery opponents had already completely taken over the House of Representatives. So the Senate here was making sure that there wasn't going to be any move against slavery, because they'd automatically veto it, them being mostly made up of white slaveholders. And so I see this, and I think the interest of the minority is not going to be inherently valuable, because it's not like the interests of the majority are going to be inherently wrong. There's issues here where it's going to be complex. In the issue of slavery, it's definitely going to be the interest of the majority. In that case, we're right. And so when I look at this whole situation, I see it as less of a cut and dried, the interests of the minority need to be here to make sure that the interests of the majority just don't go off the rails, taking over everything. Generally, the interests of the majority should be upheld. I don't think there's a clear and cogent case for saying that the interests of the minority need to be upheld above the interests of the majority, unless you are talking about rights of individuals here. So I don't think unless there's rights involved, that we should inherently say that the interests of the minority need to be protected above the interests of the majority here. And that's basically my point on the whole issue of interest of the majority versus interest of the minority. Definitely they should be considered, and the majority needs to take that in mind. But when we're talking about having the interest of the minority chosen above the interest of the majority, as there must be when you only can choose one president, I don't think it's right to say the interest of the minority need to win out. And one other thing on the whole idea of the original intent and the Electoral College typically ending up the same as the popular vote. Now, I think it's pretty clear that when we're discussing contrasting these two systems, we need to look at the situations where one gives us one result and the other gives us the other result. For example, 2016. Like, if the Electoral College and the popular vote give us the same amount result every time, then there's no advantage to having one or the other. We need to be looking at the situation where they basically come into conflict here. And I think when we see those situations, it's when we're saying one person's votes, a minority's votes, are more valuable than a majority's interests. And as I've already explained, I don't think that's something we can say. The original intent was actually to say the aristocratic interests should be held basically in balance with the people's interests. That system has gone away now. And as you said, it's kind of this accident of us caring about the minority here and having this system. But I don't think it's an accident that needs to remain. We as a country have become far more democratic over the past 200 years. And I think that's a system we need to continue doing. And the Electoral College is a major impediment.
Yeah, no. So I get what you're saying, how you think that the Electoral College system, especially in these votes where it's the deciding factor, it doesn't go with the popular vote, favors the minority over the majority. And sometimes that is the case. I mean, I'll admit to it. Sometimes that does happen, that the issues of the minority groups end up overshadowing that of the majority. But I don't think that's the case the majority of the time. 5 times out of 45 presidents has this happened. Most of them, 1824, John Quincy Adams, only 18 actually had electoral votes during that election. So they're very outdated, minuscule examples. And so I don't think that's, necessarily a fair accusation to make when it's so rare that happens. It's a very, outlier example. But two, the system itself doesn't always, necessarily place them above, but it just weights them to also cater to their needs. So I understand that, some of Wyoming may have more power per vote than somebody in California, but at the end of the day, California still has 55 electoral votes compared to Wyoming has, a minuscule amount. I believe it has 3 electoral votes. I'm not going to Google it,
that's correct.
Yeah. And so, while I understand that each vote counts for more, there's still already that buffer between the people and the president, because California is already just such a bigger target and it's worth more to go and try and take it. But I don't think that changed in the popular vote, because once again, the Electoral College reflects the population, vastly, besides the few states that only have 3 electoral votes. And so I can completely get behind a reworking of the system to where the people in Wyoming and these smaller states maybe don't have votes, or maybe, they redo how many votes per population so that it's weighted much more evenly.
So how do you see that? Just a quick question. How do you see that happening?
It's difficult always, changing, the ancient traditions of the U.S. But, you can always go through, it'd have to be through Congress and then eventually go to the Supreme Court to somebody try and challenge it. But it's very difficult, and I don't think it'll be easy. But that's a system I can get behind, more than simply switching to a popular vote. If they came and they wanted to say, we want to rework the amount of representatives you get in the House, and therefore the amount of Electoral College you get per population, then you can go and, somebody like California will be worth more, just reflect their population closer. I think that's fair, but it should also find that balance between, outweighing the minority and then just completely supporting the majority, right? Because if you can't just have it simply reflect the population, because that basically just makes it the popular system. But at the end of the day, it's like you can't just overshadow the minority groups. So I do think that their vote needs to be weighted somehow, so that the peach farmer in South Georgia vote is weighted differently than the person that works the 9-to-5 job in California in a factory, because their needs are different, even though they live in the same country.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from with that. And that's where I think representative democracy comes in. Because the whole idea of representative democracy is I don't get to say, I want Senate Bill 1070 passed right now, and I'm going to vote on that. It's like the senators get to choose that. And the senators are going to be consulting special interest groups. They're going to be consulting their constituents. They're going to be consulting all kinds of people. And it's going to come down to what do they think is the best? It's not just most people have voted for this. It's what's the best option as an expert on this policy? What do I say? And they're going to be accountable to all kinds of people in terms of that. So I don't think our system does overshadow minorities at all. But basically the point is, I'm going to get back to this in just a minute after I address your other argument about how it's very rare.
Okay.
But basically the point is, it's going to privilege some voters above others, especially when it comes to the presidency here. So when you say that it's very rare to see it happen, I agree that it is kind of rare. But I can't tell you off the top of my head how many presidential elections we've had. 40 presidential elections, not just
elections.
I'm guessing somewhere around 50 for 200 years. It's probably somewhere around, let's say 60, 65.
Yeah, somewhere in that ballpark, yeah.
Well, yeah, anyway, so then let's say 5%, 5 elections where it's gone the other way. So then you have a failure rate of roughly 1 in 13. And that's a pretty significant failure rate when you're talking about the government of the largest democratic nation on earth. Well, like the largest, are we the largest democratic nation on earth? No, I think India's got us, but, well, the world's oldest republic, at least. Let's come up with some epithet for the United States. So basically we have a pretty bad failure rate for a republic, for a democracy here. So even if it is rare to see it happen, it's still significant because of the magnitude of a presidential election, I'd say. And in order to determine whether we need the Electoral College or the popular vote system, we have to see what are the unique advantages to either one. And we only see that when the Electoral College is conflicting with the popular vote system and what would have happened. So then lastly, and this is, I think, our most important argument we have here, is the idea that you said that it doesn't always weigh it above, that it basically can cause people to consult without actually putting the minority above the majority. And I think I have to inherently disagree with this point, because the Electoral College, as I pointed out at the very beginning here, is privileging some voters above others. There's not only the actual privileging of saying your vote is more valuable than the guy in Californians, but it also is the implicit privilege involved in saying, oh, look, you are in a swing state, therefore we're going to have to care more and pay more attention to you as a voter than if you live in a safe state. And so I think inherently it privileges some voters. Sure, it may make people more attention to the concerns of people in Ohio, but the concerns of people in New York, if they're minorities there or majority, needs to be just as valuable to any president or any elected representative as the interests of the person in Ohio.
Okay, so I'll touch upon a few of these points. So first of all, there's been 56. I Googled. There's been 56 elections. Okay, 52 were selected. So it's about 11% of the time. The popular vote does not align with the Electoral College vote. But like I stated earlier, a lot of those are kind of outlier examples because how early there were 1824, 1876, 1888. Then another one doesn't happen until 2000. And then if you look at how many, I believe in 1888, it was less than 100,000 votes that, was the swing. I think with Trump, it was somewhere around 1 million, which is, there's 350 million people in America. And so that's a pretty small margin of, how much it varies. And so you talk about the privilege, how the swing states. I think I agree that is a problem with the Electoral College system. I think it's a problem, with, the United States as a whole, with being broken up into states like that. But I think the problem comes in that with the popular vote system, I don't really think it would solve it as much, because with the electoral college system, you do get the few voters to go over the line, and then you win the state. But the popular vote system, if it's it just kind of changes the face of the game, right? Because normally when a swing state happens, it's because there's some legislation that the opposing opponent has, put forth that, causes unrest, or someplace like Florida where it's constantly changing population, right? You get some more immigrants into a certain state, can cause a swing state, something like that. I don't think that would change with the popular vote system, because either way, if something happens to make these states become unrest in a swing state, you still have to go in there and campaign for them. So I don't think that fixes the inherent issue of swing states necessarily.
Okay, yeah. So I think we're down to the last 5 minutes. So I'm going to give my last couple of arguments and sum it up from my side, and then I'll hand it over to you. So basically, I think the reason, and the primary reason, I advocate for this issue of the popular vote as opposed to the Electoral College is one of principle. Now, it's been a widely recognized issue in our history, and this is actually Supreme Court precedent, that there should be one man, one vote. And that's where the whole issue of gerrymandering comes in, and that's a whole other discussion. But the point is, throughout America, we've held to this principle of having one person, one vote. And not only the whole idea of having one person, one vote, but having everybody's vote weighed equally. And then inherently, we've voted for and we've supported popular democracy. That certainly should have some limits on it. That's where representative republics and the whole idea of bills of rights comes in. But when we're talking about privileging some people's votes above others, it's very problematic, because when we say that somebody's votes are more important than somebody else's, what we have there is the very opposite of the democratic ideal. And so when you see this whole issue of the popular vote versus the Electoral College, I've studied both sides of this issue. I've read books on the Electoral College and even why it should stay around. But what I've ultimately come to is the conclusion that because of the inherent anti-democratic nature of the Electoral College, as rare as it may be for it to go the other direction from the popular vote, we need to be supporting the ability of the people to choose their representatives and to be weighed equally in choosing the president of the United States. So I do think it does change things. Maybe it doesn't have that much of a substantial change on president's electoral campaigning patterns, though I think I've made the case that it would. But I think it has an enormous impact on the integrity of our democracy. I think by choosing a popular vote system, we're choosing a system that's going to be far more fair and far more equal to all the people involved. And because it's going to mean that people are going to be equal and are going to have a fair say in our democracy, that's why I think we need to get rid of the Electoral College.
Okay, so start off with your idea of one man, one vote, and how that's kind of what America was built on. Well, one, I'm going to have to disagree with that point. America was built on one white property owner, one vote, and then eventually turned into, 3/5 compromise. You can get some representatives if you're a black person. You don't get a full, vote. And eventually it's come into the system today. I think that a lot of that's because, the Electoral College system, in a way, and how minorities do get empowered more than just, the population reflects. And like I said, I understand your complaints with the Electoral College system. It is far from perfect, but I don't think the popular system fixes the inherent issues that we have, in our democracy, right? So when true democracies don't work, I think we, kind of talked about that earlier. You talked about a true democracy, everybody voting on a bill, and obviously we're a republic, but and then the system just puts it in a place where it makes it a more fair system for all. Like I talked about, first of all, not everybody votes in an election, right? If everybody's vote was actually worth one vote, more people probably would vote in an election. You'd probably see many more of, examples of the tyrannical majority, right? Because if I'm, let's say I'm a Republican and I live in California, then I'm probably not going to waste my time going to a voting booth when it comes to the Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump 2016 election to start. But I just think that the popular vote system does not empower minorities the way that the Electoral College system should, and it opens the door for the precedent for tyrannical majorities to kind of pave the way over the legislation and who gets appointed into offices, right? And some people kind of feel the opposite because with Donald Trump elected, not many people were happy about that. But I still think there would be a pretty significant impact if we changed to a popular vote system that would not benefit America for the better. It's always a pleasure to debate with you. I hope we get to debate again soon. Congratulations being an RD. I don't think we've gotten to talk debate since it happened, so congrats.
Yeah, thanks, dude. I always enjoyed debating you. You're very thoughtful and.
Thank you. I look forward to debating you soon. Thank you again for the topic.
You too.